Welcome to our Nation State Dialogue Series. राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's our pleasure and privilege to have with us Major General Dipankar Banerjee. Most of you must be knowing about him, but just a brief introduction about Major General Dipankar Banerjee is he's an alumnus of the prestigious RIMC, that is Rashtriya Indian Military College. He served in the Indian Army for 36 years from 1961 until his voluntary retirement in 1997. He was the founding member of Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in New Delhi, a New Delhi-based think tank. And prior to this, he was the deputy director of IDSA, MP-IDSA, which is now called as. He has held visiting fellowships at the United States Institute of Peace and the Henry E. Simpson Center, Washington, United States. He has published many works, and some of his edited books are Comprehensive and Cooperative Security in South Asia, which was published in 1998. Confidence Building Measures in South Asia, which was published in 1999. CBMs in South Asia, Potential and Possibilities, published in 2000. And South Asia at Gunpoint, Small Arms and Light Weapons Proliferation, which was published in 2000 again. So you can check many of other works that he has been writing, and he's been very vocal in many of the forums. So we have invited him today to discuss on India's neighborhood policy and relations with China. So very warm welcome to you, Major General Dipankar Banerjee, to our YouTube channel. Hope it will be a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
So let me start by asking about after PM Narendra Modi came to power, one of the focal issues of his continued policy orientation has been neighborhood first policy, right? But in the current situation, over the years since 2014, where we see problems cropping up in the neighborhood, especially in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and now even Pakistan is struggling to sustain its economy. How do you see the Indian government has dealt with its neighbors, and what are the major challenges India faces with its neighbors?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kochar. It's indeed a privilege to be on your program. The program titled Nation State Dialogue, I think, is very important at this stage. And you have a wonderful audience, mainly students and scholars of South Asian strategic issues. And it's indeed a pleasure to be interacting with you today. Thank you so much for your generous introduction. I was also, for 4 years, heading executive director of the South Asian think tank, Regional Center for Strategic Studies, based in Colombo, which is responsible for strategic studies in all of South Asia, including and China. So over those 4 years in particular, it enabled me to travel extensively in the region and, of course, meet with scholars and others, right from postgraduate students to foreign ministers of all the South Asian countries, including China. Yes, now on the question of neighborhood policies, I think it is important to realize that policies of nations are founded on their philosophical orientation to the world, how they look at the world order, how they see their position in it, and hence, how do they plan to move forward? Under those conditions, I would like to very briefly go to the background of the foundation of these policies. I'll take 3 quick examples. One is on the Indian context itself. India has been fortunate that it has had such a long and traditional civilizational entity that it has contributed to global thinking on several areas for a very long time, and especially on the issues of geopolitics, global governance, strategy. Indian thought goes back to about 2,500 years ago, if not even earlier. I'm talking about the period of Chanakya, Kautilya, as is also sometimes called, his treaties that began sometime about 2,400 years ago, and not just one individual. It was a school of scholars going through hundreds of years, perhaps even a millennia, where these ideas evolved and developed and has therefore been incorporated and enshrined in our policies. This is, of course, continued by Prime Minister Modi since 2014, when he first assumed the prime ministership of this country. In comparison, you see the Western civilization, which was really based on the concept of colonialization and domineering tendencies, and for use of force in international relations. The entire global colonial history, going back about 1,500 years and even earlier, reflects this Western thinking of conquest, of domination, of enslavement of the people of the conquered territories, exploiting the resources of those states. And then, as we'll be discussing a bit on China as well, the Chinese concept of how they visualize world order. Now, this concept really originates in Chinese civilizational thought, encapsulated by what is quite often termed as Tianxia, or the mandate of heaven. Under this concept, China considers that it has the mandate of heaven to rule the world on behalf of the Almighty or the Supreme thing of the world. And this has shaped Chinese thinking in how they interact with the world and how they base their foreign relations. For example, even the treasure ships of Zheng He in the 15th century reflected that context, not only for exploiting and, taking the resources from all the countries in the region where its fleet could go, but through domination and conquering. And subsequent Chinese government policies, including the policies continued by the current administration in China under the Chinese Communist Party. This is the concept of all under heaven report to the emperor in Beijing, who has the mandate of heaven to dictate the order of the world. Now, it is in that context, I think we should look at Indian policies, and particularly, as you quite rightly mentioned, since Prime Minister Modi, since he assumed power in 2014 as the Prime Minister of this country. Now, in contrast to those developments, what Prime Minister Modi has been highlighting is the theory which is enshrined in our philosophical thought and understanding of the world. It is encapsulated in the Sanskrit quota of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The principle is that wall under heaven, one family under heaven. And so the world is one family. And currently, in the G20 leadership, Prime Minister Modi has also nominated the theme of the motto, perhaps if you may say, of the G20 conferences and initiatives that we're undertaking is to one of addressing one world, one nation, one state, one future. Now, these are the fundamental conceptual differences that distinguish the foreign policies of civilizations, how they approach the world, how they interact with the world, and how they contribute to global civilization. Now, once again, not to delve too much in the past, since 2014, at the swearing ceremony of the Prime Minister Modi, it was not held at the Darbar Hall, but out in the open, and all the heads of government, heads of state, or prominent leaders, not just of South Asian countries, which is our immediate neighborhood, but also the larger neighborhood, were invited and called. Because the inauguration of a new leadership in India would be a part of this larger global civilization. So what are the characteristics of this relationship? This characteristic really is that India, as the lead, as a member of this group, will work in consonance and in cooperation with its neighbors, see as to what it can give and provide to its neighbors, and how it can contribute to their peace, stability, and progress. So therefore, during that first swearing-in ceremony and subsequent interactions with each of the leaders that came to Delhi, the Prime Minister explained and dwelt it on that situation in a bit more detail. And that is the backdrop in which we need to look at our immediate relations with our neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, a very good point raised. 2014, Prime Minister Modi started with this, initiative of, calling all the South Asian, especially the SAARC country leaders, and making a new beginning of relations with the neighboring countries. That is where the neighborhood first policy came up. But one of the problems that we felt with our neighbor, especially Pakistan, is, it has been more crucial to look into. And talking about that, and the recent developments that have taken place, one of the crucial issue that makes Pakistan uneasy was the abrogation of Article 370. So how do you see it has impacted India-Pakistan relations? Will there be any influence on Indian policy with regards to POK? Or what is the position of India on Pakistan's current turmoil? These are the larger issues when we talk about India-Pakistan relations. So how do you assess them, and what is your opinion on that?
What an interesting question. But before I come to that, perhaps, if I could just briefly mention, continue with the neighborhood first policy. And, after that particular swearing-in ceremony, Prime Minister Modi made his first state visit to Bhutan, addressed the relations with Bhutan, expressed his strong support to the developments that were being undertaken by His Majesty in Bhutan, and expressed his support to that, allowed Bhutan larger scope to interact with the world, supported in all manner of means in economic development and also in security. And even earlier, under Prime Minister Vajpayee's tenure, Bhutan was encouraged far more into integrating with the world. The initiative regarding dialogue with China to settle its borders were facilitated by India. I still remember vividly, General Retd Kaul was the Vice Chief of the Indian Army, younger brother of T.N. Kaul, a very distinguished Foreign Secretary of India, having come to Bhutan in his capacity as the Vice Chief of Army Staff, and to guide them regarding initiating the dialogue to resolve Bhutan's border with China. Unfortunately, dialogues took a bit time to evolve and begin, but in recent years have received some setbacks. As I mentioned, Chinese approach to its neighbors is one of attempting to dominate, and hence it is putting pressures on Bhutan on issues of border settlement which really did not exist in the past. And hence we had this conflict in Bhutan border between China and Bhutan at Doklam, and of course that's a story in itself. I will not go into that now. And next visit was to Nepal, and Nepal, I remember, it was addressed to the joint session of Parliament. I happened to be in Kathmandu that day, had there invited by the Nepalese elite, their Nepal Council for World Affairs, to speak to the Nepalese elite on India-Nepal relations. And as luck would have it, that my lecture was scheduled the same afternoon that the Prime Minister addressed the joint parliamentary session of Nepal. That was an address that Nepalese still remember. The Prime Minister addressed all outstanding issues between India and Nepal, promised comprehensive support, and promised Nepal that India will stand by its policies and in any manner that it can. And that, I think, in a sense, was one of the finest moments in India-Nepal relations. Same evening, I spoke to the group of about 80-odd elites of Kathmandu in their United Nations Assembly, in United Nations Hall that they had in the Outer Ring Road. Anyway, that was the approach that the Prime Minister took regarding our immediate neighbors and the others as well. Now, the question that we raised regarding Pakistan, it's a very fundamental and very important issue. And that is one that confronts India's foreign policy in a very substantive way. Well, I have my views on Pakistan. I've interacted with Pakistan in various capacities for at least 30 years, from the time of the 1965, soon after the war, I had the privilege of staying in Pakistan for about 5 months without visa. This was opposite the Sialkot sector in 1965, when we went from Samba in Jammu district into Pakistan and was halted just 3-4 kilometers from the Sialkot cantonment. And since then, over next 4 decades or so, I've had intimate discussion with them. The problem with Pakistan is that it is fundamentally flawed as a state. And I'd like to be very clear about this and like to perhaps state my case regarding it. I think the formation of Pakistan was fundamentally an act of sabotage by the British Empire imposed on the Indian subcontinent. The very idea of Pakistan does not have any legitimacy, that Muslims form a separate identity in a nation state, and therefore they must have their own and independent nation, goes against all the dogmas, all the principles of a nation state. And as long as this principle continues, Pakistan will be a major source of conflict, not just in South Asia, but as we have seen in much of the world. Now, without going into anything further than that in this, but on the question of India-Pakistan relations, hence, the Article 370, which you referred to, was really a short-term limited measure to address a current problem that came about after Pakistan's aggression on Jammu and Kashmir at independence. And so when India took this case up to the United Nations, with the expectation that an aggressor like Pakistan, which had violated all international norms and laws in attacking Jammu and Kashmir, an open aggression by its military personnel in uniform but on leave, and Razakars from Northwest Frontier Province. So this was an attempt at normalizing this relationship. And hence, certain provisions were incorporated in the initial stages that at the vacation of this unlawful aggression, what were the arrangements for the administration of Jammu and Kashmir? Jammu and Kashmir's accession to India was as per legitimate legal provisions under the same act under which both India and Pakistan came into existence after the British India Independence Act. Now, with that as the backdrop, and of course, soon after that, a state constituent assembly of Jammu and Kashmir was installed, and they deliberated and resolved most outstanding issues. However, the Constituent Assembly was dissolved itself early enough without completing the process of accession of Jammu and Kashmir to Article 370. So, any provisions of the Article 370 regarding going to the will of the people, etc., has to be only after the vacation of that illegal aggression by Pakistan. As you know, since 1947, Pakistan has not done it. And hence, the ball was in Pakistan's court. If they were to vacate the aggression, further processes and normalization would have taken place. And naturally, in that process, all of the POK would have come to India first, and then subsequent arrangements arrived at. Now, because that did not happen and this anomaly persisted, it was imperative that this aberration had to be removed. And this was having a lot of detrimental impact on the people of Jammu and Kashmir, who had voluntarily, through repeated participation in the electoral process, made their political will and wishes very clear. Yet, because of this so-called aberration of this Article 370, they were deprived of the developmental assistance which really Jammu and Kashmir urgently required. Now, what foreign direct investments, even the rest of the country's investments would take place if there was a certain amount of uncertainty, certain amount of lack of assurance regarding the continuation of this political process. And so when this particular Article 370 was removed, as per the laws that existed for the purpose in the Indian Constitution, and hence that abnormality was removed. And as we are beginning to see now, Jammu and Kashmir will now genuinely become economically an integral part of the rest of the nation, and hence the people will benefit out of that process. We're beginning to see that happening. From West Asia, investments are coming to Jammu and Kashmir, will pick up very soon. Jammu and Kashmir is one of the finest international tourist destinations. Like much of Europe, that itself can take Jammu and Kashmir to a different level in per capita income and things like that. So those opportunities are now beginning to open up. And we hope that this process will continue and the Jammu and Kashmir people and the citizens of the province as an integral part of India will benefit out of those developments. And hence, I think this is a very positive development with enormous positive possibilities for all of South Asia.
Having said that, I think, but Pakistan is not going to stop just looking at there is a development for the people, but because if you see the basis on which this, as you see, the aggression took place, has continued for decades with terrorist acts. I mean, the whole region was so terrorized. Even people from Delhi, like me, were really scared to go to Kashmir. There had been opportunities where we could have traveled, but none of us were really feeling safe enough to travel to Kashmir, where, I mean, we used to see it's a heaven on earth. So I think that is really going to be a problem for Pakistan. Even now, I mean, it's going to continue as we see the kind of issues on Kashmir has been raising up. But while we're talking about Pakistan, let's stick to that and talk about, one thing which we cannot ignore is about the CPEC corridor of China under its Belt and Road Initiative. So which really, for us, it violates the territorial sovereignty of India, because it is passing through the POK. It was also one of the reasons why India did not join hands with China on BRI. So how do you assess the situation of CPEC and its influence on India-Pakistan relations? If it is developed and if it does not develop, and what are the consequences of all that debt trap that we are talking about and things like that?
Indeed, that is really a very fundamental question, especially China's policy of BRI, identifying the limitations and strategy behind the whole Chinese initiative requires a very careful consideration. But let me assure you, Dr. Kocha, I have the privilege of having been to Kashmir for the last, since 1960. And I can assure you that should you want to visit Kashmir today, you will have a very safe and a very pleasant holiday. Do make use of that opportunity. But coming to the BRI, and that's very important. Now, the whole Belt and Road Initiative, initially the One Belt, One Road Initiative of China, was a strategy developed in China since the mid-1970s and hence pushed forward very eagerly by the Chinese developmental think tanks as well as the Chinese commercial organizations and finally adopted by Xi Jinping within a month of his assuming power in the country. And soon after, he announced this at Nur Sultan in Kazakhstan and subsequently in meetings elsewhere in Southeast Asia, as well as in Durban in South Africa. Now, this is essentially a policy of colonialism in different words by the Chinese. Now, this made or attempted to make use of the major capabilities that China had developed regarding infrastructure building within China in the early 1970s onwards, and hence to export that, well, from 1960s onwards, soon after its Cultural Revolution and Deng Xiaoping's coming to power. And since then, this was a method of doing precisely that. The promise of the Belt and Road Initiative was that China would provide the financial support, its technical competence, and planning and construction capabilities for the development of infrastructure and other developmental related projects in its neighborhood. Now, that was the principle. But actually, in practice, it was an attempt at imperial extension. So, what did happen in practice all across BRI, not just in South Asia, but also, as you know, in Europe, Central Asia, and even in Southeast Asia? Now, the projects for the BRI were selected by the Chinese, funded by the Chinese, constructed and developed by Chinese workers and Chinese engineers, and hence all the authority and control over these projects will remain with China.
Right.
At the same time, all the recipient countries had to pay for it, and the loans will be available, money would be made available to Chinese banks, to these respective companies. So what did China do? Adopted corrupt politicians, convinced them that these are excellent projects for their respective countries, give them substantial amounts of money under the table, and then get these bills passed.
Something
Money was made
Sri Lanka.
available, unlike in developmental assistance, at a 0.0% rate of interest to 0.5% rate of interest, at the commercial rate of interest, which was between 6 and 10% for respective countries. As a result, when the countries accepted those projects, quite often these projects were of no commercial use. And you can look at many of these. For example, if you take the look at the Pakistani projects in the Pakistan Economic Corridor, Belt and Road Initiative projects, essentially it was for power production, developing road constructions, developing certain infrastructure, and of course, building of the Gwadar port. Now, each of these were fundamentally flawed projects. None of them were commercially viable. In Pakistan today, nobody pays for electricity. None of the elite, their businesses, pay for electricity, and therefore all power companies run at an enormous loss. Road constructions, etc., essentially with the aim of providing a link from China, Xinjiang province and the Sichuan province in the north, right up the sea coast in Gwadar, was a strategic objective of China. But very little to gain for the Pakistanis themselves. No employment. Baluchis are against Chinese incursion there and rebelled against it. People at Gwadar realized that their environment will be destroyed. They'll get no economic benefit out of it, and they do not accept this project. Initially, the development of the Gwadar port was given to the Singaporeans in the Keppel under Keppel shipyard's direction, etc., etc. Once they accepted the project and they realized the loopholes, no infrastructure development in Gwadar at all, no commercial benefit for anybody, they promptly withdrew. And now the Gwadar port remains idle, not yet commercialized. Sri Lanka, it was even a greater disaster. Infrastructure that was not required were built at enormous expense, and the Sri Lankans were asked to pay for it. Of course, the ruling political leadership benefited out of it. Much of it came up in southern Sri Lanka with the benefit of the family, and hence all those projects. The wonderful cricket stadium, one cricket test match takes place 5 days in a year. Huge airport. For a country like Sri Lanka, Colombo was a wonderful airport serving all its requirements. A new airport, one aircraft a day. Hambantota port, I think it doesn't get any ship at all. And Sri Lanka has gone bankrupt. And the Sri Lankan government is unable to pay for it. And China, legitimate thing would have been for them to waive off the loan, which was badly planned and badly this thing. And but they are willing to offer larger loans with bigger interest rates. Anyway, fortunately, some sort of a compromise seemed to have been struck with the International Monetary Fund, and we might see the end of it. So fundamentally, this Belt and Road Initiative has been flawed in its conception and exploitative in its planning, and mean for the advantage of China, not for the recipient countries. So as a result, much of the BRI projects, except for some in Central Asia and in Europe as well, rest are really failing. And the leadership of respective countries, which must come to their senses and be careful in falling into the trap of this BRI from China.
But when you're talking about, the countries need to be really careful. Another example, which actually you were talking about, is of Nepal. I mean, Nepal has also signed BRI. And after Prime Minister Modi's first visit, which you just mentioned, I did see a lot of support for India in terms of, the books were, there were a flood of books actually on Modi, talking about and praising about Prime Minister Modi. But after this BRI has been signed, after, some of the, the communist united, of course, now it is not. Again, there is a, division in the national communist, the United Communists that the UML and Maoist formed. There were a lot of, tensions between India and Nepal. So how do you see Nepal is going to be affected with these same BRI projects or the China's influence in Nepal? Could there be impact in the neighborhood, and how India would deal with that?
Very interesting, Dr. Kocher, that you raised the question of Nepal once again. Now, as it happened, just about a few months after Prime Minister's first visit to Nepal, he came to attend, came to participate in the SAARC summit, which was taking place in Kathmandu. And along with the SAARC summit, I had a project for engaging the civil society and the foreign policy establishment of all of SAARC countries. And we are having a book release in Kathmandu, to which I invited the Nepalese foreign minister to the book release. And the Prime Minister was expected the same afternoon, and then to take part in the SAARC summit. As it happened, Prime Minister Modi had planned the visit from eastern Nepal with the idea of building substantive cooperative projects with Nepal, along with our religious connections with eastern Nepal, with Ramayana, etc., as a larger tourist circuit, which would have benefited Nepal enormously, as well as parts of Northeast India as well. Unfortunately, Nepalese government was very reluctant to allow him to come by that route. And so our book release, the foreign minister happened to be in the cabinet meeting in Kathmandu. He couldn't come and do the book release. And later he informed the tensions that were taking place within the Nepalese government on such issues. So we do have tensions within South Asian countries regarding their willingness and ability to cooperate with India. And these are sensibilities I think we have to keep in mind. And by and large, we have done that. But we should be prepared for certain setbacks in that regard. And hence, all is not entirely smooth in the India-Nepal relations. But the substantive projects that we have offered Nepal now, selling off power from Nepal to Bangladesh, which was an issue under discussion for some time, additional resources being provided to Nepal, have addressed those questions very substantively. Now, in that context, if I can very briefly come and discuss on the Bangladesh attitude towards the BRI. Sheikh Hasina realized that for the very fundamental developmental needs of Bangladesh, they needed that Padma Bridge, which would link North and South Bangladesh in an all-weather proper road connection and benefit the Bangladesh economy very substantively. And of course, there was an offer from China. Sheikh Hasina was very wise and she refused that offer, and she decided that she will do that project entirely with her own resources in Bangladesh. She put the Bangladesh army to task, and now, with international assistance, they have managed to construct that very major infrastructure project entirely within Bangladesh resources, Bangladesh planning, and Bangladesh execution. And they're very confident of achieving similar projects in future. There are tensions with Bangladesh-China relations. I don't think we need to go into that any further at this stage. But nevertheless, overall, our policies regarding these countries, especially today, are bearing fruits and can move forward in a positive direction.
Okay, talking about the BRI projects and things like that, one of the things which is very crucial for Asia is China-India relations, obviously, and especially considering that to sustain peace and harmony in Asia, the normalization of India-China relations is very important. So, considering the major changes that is happening globally, especially the Ukraine war and the hype of China's possible attack on Taiwan, while our border problem remains unresolved, what is the future that you see of India-China relations? Can there be cooperation between India and China to create an Asian century? Can our border issue be resolved, though we already have had 17 rounds of four commanders meet? What are the challenges for this relationship to work smoothly for the 2.7 billion plus population or so?
Dr. Kocher, this is such a fundamentally important question of our times. I wish we had an entirely different, separate seminar on this. Unfortunately, I've been involved in the process for a very long time, India-China relations. My first visit to China was in 1991, when after the Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in 1988 and the long handshake with Deng Xiaoping, it was decided that both countries will resume its military-to-military contacts. Before that, 4 Chinese generals had visited India in 1957, and a very good meeting in India, and that was to be resumed. I was then commanding a division in Kashmir in very difficult conditions, but the army chief said that I must go. Along with another general, I visited China in 1991 June. And it was at that time that I realized that there were a lot of goodwill, not just within the PLA, that is, of course, somewhat peculiar, somewhat difficult, but among the Chinese population at large. We had meetings because of the PLA invite, and so allowed to meet all the top leadership in the military and everywhere else, and very fruitful discussions. Lot of potential goodwill. And as you mentioned, if India-China relations could be cooperative and positive, it could shape the destiny not just in Asia. And this is what I was told by numerous senior Chinese leaders, academics, and everybody else, that it had the potential to do a lot of good for the world. However, there remain very fundamental questions in that as well. as you know, and that is why I tried to mention regarding China's attitude towards the neighbors and attitudes towards neighborhood relations. This entire concept that China has the mandate of heaven and hence is entrusted with the final word in international affairs, which will suit and support China's interests, goes against the fundamental principles of cooperation. Since at least the 1930s, Jawaharlal Nehru and of course Rabindranath Tagore mentioned exactly what you mentioned, that India-China cooperation was vital for a rejuvenated Asia-Pacific. And that, for example, Rabindranath Tagore paid 2 visits to China at the invitation of the Chinese intellectuals in Shanghai and Beijing and other places, several places in China, and talked to them about these issues. He made a very fine impression. Tagore's works are perhaps better known and learnt in China than many places in India today. But nevertheless, Chinese were then suspicious of Tagore's attitude and approach as equals. And there, China was in the process of their new nationalism. KMT was in power, and all those developments taking place in the 1920s. And then they did not attract, on a political level, it did not carry as much weight as it should have. But in spite of that, we had other means of cooperation and communication, etc., etc. And there is enormous potential for collaboration and cooperation. But I think there are a couple of things that require to be fundamentally addressed. We are new nation states, in spite of being old civilizational entities, and it requires the attributes of a nation state, where boundaries between nations must be clearly demarcated, understood, and respected. And this is one term that Chinese must come to accept. Their position till to date is extremely unhelpful in this regard. As you know, since 2006, 2008, they claim all of Arunachal Pradesh. They are creating problems for us in our borders in the Bhutan area, Bhutan to India area, and in Ladakh. They're in fundamental contradiction of their own positions, earlier agreements regarding the settlements that were agreed on the boundaries and the process of resolving this issue. So that remains a fundamental question. Secondly, I would suggest that we need to deal with China, which is more democratic, more in consonance with global developments, and more in agreement with democratic processes and procedures, and through international organizations, including the United Nations and many of the international understandings, agreements, etc., as well as bilateral agreements. Respect for those. Unfortunately, my final summary regarding this is that it is not in a favorable position to be addressed now. And as a consequence of current developments, both in Ukraine and the likely complications in the China-Taiwan issue, this is going to be a period of some tension and difficulties in India-China relations.
I mean, yeah, you're right that there has to be one demarcated line between, or a border between India and China for any kind of further cooperation or exchanges that India-China really needs to have. But that fundamental issue is what is hampering the people's aspirations. It's hampering the societies to develop. It is hampering our own economic developments and mutual understanding. I think that is one of the core issues which both on Indian and Chinese side need to understand. Even if India is taking an initiative or India is not taking an initiative, both sides needs to stand up to this thing to make this happen. Because this is not for our generation, this is for all future generations as well. On that note, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure talking and listening to you, Major General Dipankar Banerjee. I'm sure that, as you rightly mentioned, we can have long seminars and discussions over, issues that we have taken up, because this is a short, crispy kind of a channel where we want to just focus on certain areas, let our viewers, especially our students and researchers, to understand certain things about what is happening in the global arena and many of the issues which concern India on its national interest. And hope we continue our interactions. Thank you very much. To our viewers, please hit the like icon and subscribe to our channel for many more such interesting discussions with many scholars and practitioners and people who are going to be on our channel. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you, Dr. Coach. Thank you.